afternoon, good evening. Welcome to the first edition of the Superintendent's Corner of the 22-23 school year. Today I've assembled one of our A-teams to talk to the community about our efforts to address the facility-related needs of Glenbrook and Williams Middle School. We've been on a journey as a community to both study and strategically address the needs of the two schools. It goes back to as early as 2015 when the town commissioned JCJ Architects to do a full study of Glenbrook and Williams. And a few years later, in 2021 actually, we commissioned Colliers International to do a facility condition study as well. Both of those reports concluded that Glenbrook and Williams were essentially approaching the end of their useful life, and we'll talk a little bit about what that means in our conversation today. But to put it simply, I think the way I've talked about this is that we're at a crossroads with regard to both Glenbrook and Williams, and neither building have experienced a significant renovation since they were initially constructed. And so we are at a point where we need to make some significant decisions to ensure that we have facilities that are suitable for 21st century education and in a condition to educate students well into the future. Really, the conditions that we're talking about today go well beyond typical custodial care or typical maintenance care, even go beyond what the town could reasonably be expected to address via the typical capital planning process. And so it was, in recent years, the school committee, working collaboratively with the select board, had submitted what's called statements of interest to the Massachusetts School Building Authority. The MSBA partners with local communities to address facility needs of schools across the Commonwealth. And we were fortunate in May of 21 to, May of 22, to receive an invitation from the MSBA into their core renovation program. Essentially, that was a signal that they were prepared to work with the town of Longmeadow to address the needs that we've identified in both Glenbrook and Williams. And so that was a great turning point for us, and I was so appreciative that the select board and the school committee worked collaboratively on the submission of that statement of interest. To help us signal to the MSBA that we were in need of some solutions to address the needs at Glenbrook and Williams. Essentially, in the statement of interest, we documented the physical plant needs of those two schools, and were able to successfully convince the MSBA that there was a level of need that suggested we were in need of the state level partnership. And so with that invitation, in August of 22, we kicked off what was called the eligibility period with the MSBA. And during this 270-day eligibility period, we have been required to deliver a series of reports to the MSBA to ensure that we were ready to continue in the capital pipeline with the MSBA. So during this eligibility period, we were asked to commit an enrollment study. We're asked to pull together a school building committee. And most significantly, we're asked to commit to funding of a major feasibility study. And we'll talk about that as we go on today. And so that feasibility study would be an in-depth study to take an even deeper look at the needs of the two schools and potentially point towards some solutions. That process, though, takes some time. We'll need to obviously partner with the town to identify a funding mechanism for that feasibility study and ultimately seek approval at town meeting. Now, just to project forward, because I'm often asked about this by community members, if we were to commit to that feasibility study and complete that feasibility study, and if we were to identify some potential solutions, it would be an opportunity for us to take a hard look at both Glenbrook and Williams and to assess what the best, most cost-effective, most educationally appropriate solution would be to address the needs of those buildings and ensure that we have school facilities that can educate students well into this century. As part of that, it is very likely that we will, as part of that feasibility study, explore the potential for combining Glenbrook and Williams into a single middle school. Right now we have 2 middle schools that are much smaller than the typical middle school in Massachusetts, and that presents some challenges given the overall enrollment of both Glenbrook and Williams. But we think that our preliminary sense is that we would be well positioned to serve the students of Longmeadow more effectively in a combined setting. But ultimately, the feasibility study would need to take a hard look at that and help us understand if in fact that is true. And along with the sort of the enrollment considerations would just be a general consideration on whether or not it is cost effective to think about a combined middle school in Longmeadow. And so that feasibility study, it really takes a hard look at existing conditions. It takes a deeper look at our enrollment patterns. It does a study of our existing educational spaces and our preferred or needed educational spaces into the future. And as part of that, the feasibility study establishes some design parameters that we would have to work within. Our friends at LCTV may be projecting at this point a sort of a timeline for how this could shake out over the next few years. If a feasibility study is agreed to, if it is completed, and if an option is identified, we would go through the process of, at that point, identifying and working with an owner's project manager and a design team, and we would be going down the road towards design development. And ultimately, potentially, based on a really conservative timeline, we could be in that design development phase in the fall of '26 or into the summer of '27. The process could move more expeditiously depending on sort of what the local decision-making processes look like. But I know that we're projecting many years ahead. But it's an exciting conversation for the town of Longmeadow. I think it's a needed conversation. I've often said that we're at a stage where to do nothing really is not an option with regard to our 2 middle schools. We really have to make some critical investments given the needs of these 2 facilities. So that brings us to the team that is assembled here today, and I'd like to introduce the folks that are with me. Nick, to my right, Nick Dragantis is the facilities director for the town of Longmeadow. Our town manager was gracious enough to join us, Lynn Simmons, thanks for joining us, and a principal of one of our middle schools, Glenbrook Middle School, Nikcole Allen. So thank you all for joining us, and they each bring some critical experiences and some critical understandings that will help us through this process. Before I get to the what or the how, maybe it's important to talk about the why. Why are we at this point where we need to address the two middle schools? So I'll start with Nick, our facilities director. I've often said in sort of shorthand ways that we're at a point where we have to make some critical decisions, that these 2 facilities really haven't experienced a major renovation, and that we have to think ambitiously about the needs of the 2 schools. So maybe at a systems level, if you could kind of give us a bird's eye, give the community a bird's eye understanding of the needs of the 2 buildings, and if you want to talk about them in a combined way or individually, that
Sure.
would be helpful.
The needs of both buildings actually are kind of similar. I would define my role in town as ensuring the safety, security, and comfort of all the inhabitants of our facilities here in town. And given the age of these 2 buildings, it's getting pretty difficult to ensure those things for the occupants. Starting from the top down, there's many needs. The roofs themselves are quite old. They're circa 1996, the both of them. And what that does, it presents a lot of challenges. Once we have water infiltration, leaks present mold, poor air quality. So really starting from the top, these facilities, we need to address them, and they're quite expensive to fix. as well as HVAC systems. Those have not been updated in quite some time. There have been a few updates here and there, but these are all connected to original plumbing and original vents. So you can imagine how long those have been sitting encased in concrete in some places, and actually have hazardous materials that insulate them as well. My team is straight out usually in both of these buildings. I think you can attest to that we are in and out all the time. The electrical loads of these buildings are maxed out. We've pretty much done as much as we can to duct tape and bubble gum these facilities together, but the needs, as you had mentioned, certainly surpass what my team is capable of, and the investment needed is great.
Yeah, so I think you gave us a great summary when you think about these buildings systemically in terms of the HVAC systems, plumbing systems, the electrical systems, the building envelopes. Really, at a systems level, we've got some significant need, and that really goes back to what I was saying earlier, that this isn't really a matter of ordinary maintenance or even typical capital investments. These are really systemic issues that need to be addressed in both the schools. So the statement of interest that was in fact accepted by the MSBA was the Glenbrook statement of interest, where Nikcole serves as principal. We have an opportunity in this process, though, to study both buildings through the feasibility study process. But let's start with Glenbrook. Nikcole, you're obviously really familiar with the building,
Sure.
and maybe where the systems that Nick described meet the educational needs of the facility. So maybe start with the open classroom design at Glenbrook. It goes back to the early 70s when sort of open classrooms were in vogue.
Right.
But really that design, that arrangement has really kind of outlived its usefulness and creates some problems both for our maintenance team, but also educationally. Can you talk a little bit about the open class,
design?
the open,
yeah,
open,
it is.
yeah.
Yes, the open floor design at Glenbrook is quite interesting. It's basically our whole 6th grade has just collapsible walls in between each of the classrooms, but everything else is open. So if you're walking down the 6th grade hallway, you have full view of each room right next door to one another. And therefore you hear each teacher instructing and each child who's interacting. You can hear all that. Now I think our students get used to that. Once they're there for a couple of weeks, it's just something you have no choice to get used to. So they've maintained it really well down there, but it definitely is something that is impacts learning. Whether they're trying to watch something, they're lowering something so they don't disrupt the classroom next door. So that, all that kind of stuff is that there's no door to shut and to kind of have that kind of like good loud energy happening in a classroom, because when that's happening downstairs in 6th grade, it's totally chaotic. Which is kind of difficult. So, and also those collapsible walls, when we go back to the electrical, I know there's no electric outlets on any of those walls, and it's very limited downstairs on electricity. Actually, in the entire building, it's limited with the electricity that we have. So, that's interesting. The collapsible walls are interesting because you can open them if you want to have 2 classrooms combined for any reason, but all the other reasons that we're sharing, it's really hard.
Yeah. If you think about the way today's classrooms and the technology needs, and also the group work involved in learning today, and we know now that learning can be loud, should be loud, can be messy,
yes,
and kids learn effectively in those settings, and sometimes the open design compromises that. Now, one of the questions I'll get, Nick, is, well, why not just build walls up to the ceiling as a way to address this? Isn't it as simple as that? So what?
No, it's not. At Glenbrook, the building was designed as an open concept, and those HVAC systems were incorporated into that open concept. So the supply for heat goes into the exterior walls of the classroom and is then sucked to the return side of the system, which is located in the common areas in the hallway. So if we were to enclose those classrooms, you're then restricting the system's use. You won't get proper air exchange, and we'll end up with a system failure.
Even the lighting would be affected, probably. It's
correct.
Yeah.
The lighting is shared from common areas and classrooms.
Right.
There's many modifications you'd have to make should we enclose those classrooms. It's a nice thought to fix, but not very practical.
And life safety systems would be a challenge if you were just to build the walls up?
Correct. We'd have to
Yeah.
put detection systems within each classroom, which can come at a cost.
Yeah. So maybe we can talk, we'll come back to some of the educational considerations, but I want to turn it back, if I could, now that we're on that topic, of sort of the life safety systems at both buildings, at Williams and Glenbrook, and maybe you can give us a little picture of where we are with those systems.
Sure. Well, the biggest thing would be both of the schools do not have a fire suppression system, with exception of their kitchens, which this day and age is a no-no. Should there be an event in the school, a fire event, we would be relying on someone with a fire extinguisher to put it out. There are no systems in place to actually suppress a fire.
They're within what's allowable. What we have is what's allowable and considered safe given the age of the building, but in a newer building, you'd have much more robust life safety systems, I guess.
Correct.
And so that's true across the two middle schools. And accessibility, I'll maybe turn to Nikcole, and then Nick, feel free to add in, but the accessibility challenges of our two middle schools, and you can talk about Glenbrook and Williams if you're able to.
Yeah, so more so for the handicap accessibility.
Sure.
So we have 3 levels at Glenbrook. 6th grade has its own level with 1 CIA downstairs, an elective. And then we have our level that has all our other electives as well as our cafeteria. And then we have the next level that has the main office and the 7th and 8th grade wing and library. So if we have a student who's in a wheelchair, that makes it really challenging for us to get that student to all 3 levels. So we are creating different schedules, working around the student. And then, some kids get hurt in sports and are on crutches. And, so we are very limited in what we can do. And it's pretty challenging in our building to get someone around it. If they are in a wheelchair, if they're in crutches, any kind of issue like that, it's super challenging for us to get a child around the building and make sure that they, it's fair to them as well. So.
And the doorways in some places are remarkably narrow. Right?
Yes,
Yeah.
really small.
Yeah.
So that's also another issue as well.
I mean, you have if any community members happen to be in the building, one of the places you might get a good view of that is in the guidance suite
Right.
at Glenbrook, which is a beautiful suite, right?
Yeah.
It's kind of nicely situated, but the openings to those
Yeah.
guidance offices.
Right. So even
and
if
the
we get a
counseling
child
offices.
to the floor,
Yeah.
they
It's a
can't access
challenge.
some rooms
Yeah.
as well because of the size of our doors.
Yeah. So anything else on accessibility that's worth noting, Nick, in terms of Glenbrook or Williams?
It's not just personnel accessibility. It's if we need to move items around the school. If we have moves in the summertime, custodians are then required to bring these items up and downstairs versus using them in an elevator. So it's really
And the
expansive.
even the equipment in the restrooms for any individuals who might be in a wheelchair, that's a challenge as well. I suppose.
Correct.
Yeah.
Yep.
Yeah. So thank you for that. And Nikcole, going back to sort of some of the educational considerations, and again, sort of taking a look at the why. Why are we exploring the needs of the two middle schools? Why are we developing this strategic plan to address the needs of the two middle schools? From your perspective, what are some of the other educational limitations at Glenbrook or Williams that your staff experiences and students experience?
Sure. I have a list of things that actually both Williams and Glenbrook kind of some of the things that are challenging in that area. So we share staff. So what's difficult is that depending on what time of the day the staff is in our building, or if it's every other day they're in the building, what's hard is that they can't collaborate with the teachers or go to team times and kind of check in on kids, but they also can't be available for students. So if this teacher's ending their day at Glenbrook, there might be a kid over at Williams at the end of the day that'd like to see that teacher, but they can't because they're at our building. So if we were to have one building, that would remedy that kind of situation. Right. And we're also losing instructional time because there's a travel block for those teachers to go back and to go back and forth as well.
So just to underscore that, the size of the with the enrollment that we have, sometimes we don't have enough need for a full-time position at each school, so
Correct.
we're sharing staff across the two buildings.
And this is really the music department and foreign language department.
Right.
Yeah.
What else? Any other limitations?
Yeah. So the science rooms are pretty outdated. They have, and I know that there's fume hoods. There's code now that if you're building something, you have to have, and we don't have those in our buildings. We can't go over 24 students in a science lab, and it also, again, is not wheelchair accessible. A student couldn't get around in a lab in a wheelchair.
Yeah.
There have been instances where we wanted to shut off the water in a science room and the water does not shut off, just because of the age of the valves that operate those sinks.
Right. There's a decent number of sort of repurposed spaces too at our middle schools. I know that the your music classroom at Glenbrook occupies an old home ec space.
Right, and there's like a wood shop is now the art room, and so we definitely have some.
Yeah, so it was, a lot of the spaces were designed sort of late 60s, early 70s when there was more of a shop model. Now, nowadays, I know one of the things that we're looking at our middle schools is STEAM programming, and maybe can you talk about how the space at our 2 middle schools challenges our ability to introduce those type of interdisciplinary, hands-on experiences?
Yeah, the size of the room. So right now at STEAM in both buildings, for that we just started this year with the way that we're doing it, is now in the old tech classrooms. So they're in the old technology classrooms, and I know that there was a lot of work this summer by both teachers to try to turn their rooms into this welcoming STEAM environment, but it is difficult to do that because it's not the kind of vibe that typical STEAM classrooms have. So I know that that's super challenging for them, and they have a lot of amazing ideas in what they're doing and the work they're doing, but you have to find the tables, like you want, the group work, and you're working with just a lot of furniture and equipment that doesn't necessarily go with what a STEAM program is, but they're making the best of it in those different situations.
And my apologies for the acronym for the STEAM program: Science, Technology, Engineering, Arts, and Math. So
correct,
increasingly trying to find opportunities for kids to be involved in these interdisciplinary opportunities and where there's a lot of hands-on learning. So
Yeah.
Thank you for that. Anything else that's notable?
Yeah, so some other things that are noticeable is, as far as collaboration goes and teachers having space, we have one small conference room at Glenbrook and one at Williams. And they're tiny and they're not really ventilated well, and that's the only space that we have, and we use them for different meetings, but we really don't have different areas for teachers to go to collaborate, or any breakout spaces for anybody. We're really limited in that with the size of the building and what we have. Each classroom has its own purpose, and it's really tough to find space like that for staff to work together or have breakout spaces.
I was thinking about the design here at Longmeadow High. There's a lot of seminar spaces, rooms that can be flexibly purposed, and that allows a building to change and grow with time. So that's something that, our Glenbrook and Williams kind of were built in more of an industrial age, mid 20th century, and they're, sometimes the programming is constrained by the footprint and the spaces that we have.
Right.
So.
And programming is also another big factor for both buildings. So we have different programs, and different programs are housed in each of our buildings. So you could be a Williams student in a program at Glenbrook, and now you have to go to Glenbrook. And you could be a Glenbrook student with a program that's housed at Williams, and now you're going there. So I know if we had one building, it would be something that could remedy as well. But right now, with our different programming, kids are being sent to not their neighborhood school as well.
So when you refer to really very highly specialized programming for students with very specialized needs.
Correct.
Right? Yeah. And were we in a single setting, you'd have better capacity, better staffing, better space to serve those kids who have those highly specialized needs, for sure.
Right.
Yeah. Well said. So that's a little bit of the why, and hopefully it gives community members a sense of some of the educational challenges and some of the facility challenges. And now kind of turning to the what, what is the sort of strategic plan to address the needs of the 2 middle schools? So at the outset, talked a little bit about the feasibility study. And so Town Manager Lynn Simmons is here with us to talk about the partnership between the school committee and the select board to potentially get behind a feasibility study. So can you talk to us a little bit about that and where we are and how that decision will be in front of residents at the October town meeting?
Sure. Thank you. Yes, so this has been something obviously we've been discussing for years after several SOI submissions, with our successful one coming this year. Earlier in August, I think it was the second meeting in August, you had attended the select board meeting. We've been briefing the school committee, and then you provided a briefing to the select board as well, just on where we were with this as we were opening up our eligibility period. So we do know that the first step would be seeking funding for a feasibility study. And having looked at what some other communities have done recently for similar sized projects, we have a fairly decent idea on what a feasibility study may cost, given that it would look at both Glenbrook and Williams. We're estimating that in about the $1.6 million range. We've looked at a bunch of different potential funding options for that, because obviously that's a large price tag to try to be able to tackle. And the one recommendation that we are going to put forward to the select board when they set the fall town meeting warrant will be a combination of both free cash money and some short-term borrowing. So we're looking at $800,000 in free cash and $800,000 in short-term borrowing. And we're developing that warrant article now. This would be for the October 25th fall town meeting. We're hopeful that we're successful at that point to keep this project moving forward.
Yeah, thanks. And so it is, I think, just to underscore the point that this is an opportunity for the residents at town meeting to consider whether or not to move forward with that feasibility study under the terms that Lynn described. I think one of the great things about this process is that there are a number of points along the way where town boards and the residents get to weigh in and either frankly stop the project or give us the green light to move forward. And that was true when the original SOI was submitted, and it will be true again this October when residents gather at town meeting to consider whether or not to fund the feasibility study. And just to circle back to what we talked about earlier, that feasibility study, it's a really critical step for us in this process, because it is our opportunity to do a deep dive, a deep study on our existing educational spaces, the preferred or desired educational spaces that would serve kids. We'll take a longer look at enrollment patterns. We would look at, in a feasibility study, would look at site conditions at both schools. It would be an opportunity to even look at traffic patterns at both schools, really, again, with an eye towards identifying the most cost-effective, the most educationally appropriate solution. So I appreciate the work that the select board and that your office has done in terms of helping us both really come up with a plan for funding that feasibility study, and then hopefully advancing it to a point where the residents get to consider it at the October 25th town meeting. Is there anything else, Lynn, from the town perspective that residents maybe ought to know about the importance of this project, why it's sort of strategically important, not just to the schools, but for the town as a whole? Is there anything that
Certainly, yeah. And I'd like to highlight that the schedule that was talked about earlier. This has been something we've been carefully considering, because we're obviously very sensitive to the timing here, taking on a large project, not just the feasibility study, but certainly if we move forward to the construction phase, how we afford that. And we've carefully looked at our debt schedule to make sure that we can retire as much debt as possible in advance of a potential building project. So we do have that timed to potentially be sometime in 2027 that we could take on additional debt to construct the building. So that's certainly a consideration, because we don't want residents having massive spikes in tax bills to try to absorb this. So we've been carefully looking at that schedule, but also recognizing the fact that so many join this community for our incredible school system. And an incredible school system means that we make investments in our actual facilities and infrastructure so that the students have a safe and welcoming environment to continue their learning. And without those facilities in place, we could be hurting that educational standing that I think we all want to hold on to really closely. So I'm excited to see where this goes, because I think it's a great opportunity for the town.
Well said, and I think just to underscore that the timeline that you mentioned even more is that we're several years away from even putting together a design team. And so, and then beyond that, it's detailed designs and construction. And so we've been thinking about this for a long time. You said it really well. Strategically, both in terms of the educational considerations, the facility-related considerations, but also the fiscal considerations to the town. So being mindful of how that will influence the tax rates, as you said. So thank you for that, and thanks. You've been a great source of guidance to help us understand, how the timeline would strategically fit with the larger needs of the town. So. Nikcole, Lynn, Nick, thank you very much. I hope this was a helpful opportunity for the residents to understand where we are with addressing the needs of both Glenbrook and Williams Middle School. There'll be plenty of additional opportunities. We have some daytime opportunities to meet in the superintendent's conference room that we issued via press release. I'll be heading to the senior center sometime in the early to mid-October. And actually, we have a middle school forum tomorrow evening, September 8th. Maybe by the time folks see this, that will be passed. But plenty of opportunities to engage community members, to answer critical questions and provide some key information. So thanks, team. I appreciate everybody's time, and
Thank you.
Thank you for having me.
have a great day.